Okay, so before I start this morning, you're going to hear a lot of me today, okay? You're going to get sick of the sight of me today. So what you need to do is every time I get too fast, tell me to slow down. And if my Australian accent is giving you a problem, we'll find an English person to stand beside me. Which they've done at conferences before. Maybe I just have to. Okay, go. There you go. Okay, so we're going to start this morning talking about stepping up from those lower trophic level plankton up into vertebrates so that we can head to eat later in the day. So one of the things when I started ecosystem modelling about 15, 20 years ago that really amused me were these people that would talk about ecosystem models and I'd rush to the paper to read it and they'd be quite frustrated. I was a little disappointed because I actually wanted to be at the fish end of things. So this is going to be a little bit of a discussion. Who else wants to eat a fish? This is going to be a little bit of a discussion of the many different ways that you could model invertebrates. So for those of you who don't know what this delightful animal is, it's a dugong. It's an Australian manatee, effectively. They're herbivores that go along and eat seagrass. And apparently sailors used to think they were mermaids. You have to be a BBC for a long time. I think that's a beautiful woman. So the kind of modelling I do, after that little bit of a burst on Atlantis yesterday, is actually the whole rill system. What we've heard about so far is this part up here. So we've heard a bit about the physical stuff and the plankton, and now we're going to concentrate on the vertebrates. And then the rest of the week is actually going to touch on the whole rest of that. So for those of you who keep telling me that you're not modelers, this is a difference equation. So basically just say the number now was the number in the past, plus any new ones that have come along, plus any that have died, minus any that have died, plus any immigration. And if you like to get a little bit fancier, you use calculus, and it's really just the same thing. The most important thing about vertebrates is, though, that there's all the different parts of the life history. And in reality, and what Eileen will show you in the next half of this talk, is that they're not really different to invertebrates. So lots of people get really fixated on vertebrates and go to enormous detail in representing them in a model. And then they'll have all the crunchy things. They'll lump them all together at the bottom. You can actually think about all the same processes that we heard about yesterday from Eileen, just for vertebrates. And a lot of the methods are the same as well. So the main parts of the life history we have to think about are how they grow. Some people think about how much metabolism is happening inside, the respiration, because that's typically where things like temperature and salinity and alkalinity pH affect the animal. So in the past, lots of people skipped over this bit, but as we get more and more worried about climate change and how it affects animals, a lot more attention is going into that. Then you've got to think about how they move, how they age. At least vertebrates don't tend to shrink. That's one twist that an invertebrate has. You can have a sea urchin this big that when it gets older is actually this big, which is a bit of a pain to have to try on. But at least the fish, it might not get any fatter, but at least it won't get any shorter. Except my grandmother ended up this tall when she started this tall, so maybe that doesn't quite work. Then you've got the mortality side of things, all the different ways that they get to die, and then there's the reproduction side of things. So if you think of a biomass pool, right? So one of the ways, for those of you who don't know what this is the Australian blobfish. It lives off Tasmania. And basically, it's really just a gelatinous mass of fish that floats about this. It's neutrally buoyant, it floats about this far off the bottom and eats anything that goes past. It's a very endangered species because when the trawlers go along, they rip it up. But it looks like a blob of biomass to me. So one of the ways of modelling, and it's used in EcoPath that we'll play with this afternoon, is not to worry about the details of how many there are or how big they are, just to say, look, if you sum all the biomass together, how much they weigh, you get this blob. And you follow how much the blob changes. So you'll have more blob added when they grow or when they have babies, and then you'll have the mortality. They die, they disappear. way of modelling animals is to actually count how many there are. So sometimes you worry about how fat or how big they are. Lots of times you just assume they're a certain size at a certain age. And then you fixate more on how they have babies and how they get new ones to swim into the system, and then how they grow. One of the most common ways of representing that kind of model is actually to start to get worried about how many little ones there are, how many medium-sized ones, how many big ones. So I don't know how many of you know much about fish, but a fish this big, a really big fish, so a fish this big, say, is about the same, produces about the same number of babies as 1,000 fish that big. So even if they're the same species, they're just a big fat one instead of a skinny small one. You really want the big fat ones because they're way better mothers than the small ones. Unfortunately, fishing catches the big ones, so that we change the productivity of the stock just by fishing them, because we've changed the kind of motherhood investment they can make. So that's why people get really interested in these kind of models. So you start off with all the little babies and they grow up in size. You have mortality killing them off as they go along. Then you get to what's called a plus group. People get bored counting fish as they get older and older and older. So they just say, all right, once they're over this age, we just add them all together. The reason they do that is it might only be 7 years for a sardine, but when you do an orange roughy, which is a big deep water, well not big, fish about that big, a deep water fish off Tasmania, it lives 300 years. So following that year by year, I was a bit of a pain, especially when I first started and we couldn't fit a matrix that big on the computer chip we were playing. So we have to think of other silly ways of doing it more. So then you have your adults up here, and they send the recruits back down to the start, and you start all over again. It's that kind of model is the most common kind of what they call stock assessment model. So every time you've got a fisheries management body in the world, whether it's inside the nation or it's one of those big international ones that cares about you, typically they're using that kind of model. So they'll have age structure, they'll follow animals through that age. They can have variable sized age, they don't have to have a smooth curve. They can have lots of spatial structure. They can have genetic stocks, not necessarily in the way that Eileen was tracking them yesterday, but they just say this area is one group that doesn't breed with this area down here, so that they can have differential pressure from a fishing boat going to the different areas. Typically what you get out the other end of the stock assessment is the kind of predicted, this is actually the spit to the current state. This is a fish from Australia, they think wasn't really fished until the late 1980s, and then they think this was roughly its biomass trajectory. So Australia's management target is to have no species less than about 48% of its unfished state. One of the problems with that we'll get to later in the week is they pretend every fish is an island, which is the opposite of what eco-park does. And they estimate that unfished state as if there were no other fish in the world. Forgetting that maybe that fish is only as productive as it is because you've already taken out all its predators. So that's one of the complications and why we move on to food-grade models. The other thing we have in Australia is a minimum stock size. So here, the management starts to tighten. If you drop below that, by the time you get to here, they close the fishery. So that's a very common method of fisheries management in most of the Western world. It's a bit harder where you can't regulate fisheries bodies. It's a little bit more chaotic, but that's kind of the basic one to see. Now, if we get on to how you can elaborate that kind of age-structured model, you start to get a little bit more agent-based. So this is actually still differential equations, it's not agent-based yet. But instead of just assuming a growth curve, you follow the average size of the average individual. So you're still doing a lot of homogeneity, you're still smearing things and assuming that they're all kind of the same, but you're not assuming they'll follow this perfect curve. What happens is they have to find prey. So this is what we use in Atlantis. They have to find prey, it then has to fit in their mouth. So if you're an animal that eats like my son, everything fits in your mouth. But most fish, that's not actually possible. They have a gape. Anything that can't get past that gape. There's a few tricky animals that trip you up, so parasites are one. The other main one is something like the cookie cutter shark, which is a tiny little shark about that big. And it swims up to the sides of big animals like whales and then bites a chunk off and runs away. So they but most of the time you can deal with them. So once they get past both of those tests, you find the prey that they can actually eat. They eat that, and then that goes into building their body. But you split that body into two parts, just like Eileen was talking about yesterday. You have the structural part, and then in a vertebrate, that's fixed. Once they've put energy into building structure, they can never get that back. Whereas in invertebrate, some of them can reabsorb their skeletons. Then you have the fatty bit. So I ceased growing any taller when I was 11. I thought I was hugely tall at that point. Mike has since proved that I am not exactly the tallest individual in the human race. But I have tended to grow outwards over the last 20 years. And that's this part. That's the part that produces stuff for reproduction. It is the part that can be sucked back in, so to speak, if they can't find enough food to eat. So you can actually represent starvation. The products of all that kind of activity, you can have losses due to disease. You can have losses due to hitting an oxygen low that they can't escape. They can also just be eaten. All of those kind of losses can feed back into the nutrient detritus. So most of those other models that we've heard about, the biomass pools and the age-structured models before this one, they don't always have the nitrogen cycle or the nutrient cycle completed. EcoPark does, to a sense, it has a detritus pool, but Atlantis, at least when I first started writing this, was one of the few models in the world that cared about closing it because it had plankton in there from the start. That's now quite common though, in end-to-end models, and there's quite a large, there's at least 15 end-to-end model types I can think of from around the world, and they've all incrementally added this part. Okay, so the basic form of the, I've just lost 3/4 of the audience, I know, but please stay with me. So the basic form of this kind of equation is the change in the vertebrates through time is dictated by how much food they find, how well they can actually assimilate it. So you don't all absorb things equally well. So, for instance, someone with my body shape seems to absorb every calorie from the smallest piece of cake possible, whereas my husband can eat the same cake and it's not going to worry him. My chief programmer can eat anything on the planet and she just doesn't change at all. So we have differential ability to assimilate, so you can represent that kind of variation, just like you can represent variation in growth. But the other part is there's different kinds of food. So I find it very much harder to get any nourishment out of a bone than I do a piece of flesh. But there's other animals that can access that bone quite readily. So you can have differential assimilation capacity based on the species and what they're actually eating. You then have the modifications based on oxygen, so you don't necessarily assimilate or metabolize as well if you're oxygen stressed. And then you've got a space limitation, and that's because there's handling and competition. So there's lots of different ways of messing each other up. You can just both race for the food at the same time, and whoever's fastest gets there first, and that's one kind of competition. Another competition is when you both get there and you have a fight about it. And some of that increases once you have space. So the space limitation is quite packed, so that's very good. And these are the mortality terms. So mathematically, there's lots of different ways of representing mortality in these models, some of which are from, you see in all different kinds of models. So one of the tricks in a plankton model is to close off the top. They use a squared term. So instead of just your numbers of minus a proportion of you that die over time, you make it a quadratic instead, so it's a squared term on the end. Now there's two ways you can justify that. One, your predators and prey will probably go up in step with each other. So it's not always a constant proportion if the predator's population oscillates with your own. So if there's more predators when there's lots of you, a higher proportion goes, and when you disappear, the predators disappear, it's actually a smaller proportion. So that's a good reason to have a quadratic. The other trick is it's mathematically stabilising in your model, which is really the main reason that lots of people do it, to tie off the top end of the model so everything doesn't go crazy with the top. When you're using that in an ecosystem model, you have to be careful of how heavily you use it, because what you can do is just create a lot of parallel species who are actually tied to each other. So you have to be careful about the matrix that you use. But as long as you're aware of why you've used it and then you're using it with care, those kind of things are okay. Then you have mortality due to oxygen and predation here as well. You can have the linear mortality